we think of the memories of the church, the spiritual centre of our community, we're also reminded too of a lifestyle that really this church carried people through. It brought us through a time when there was lots of discriminatory things happening in our community, and lots of people don't like to remember those times, but there were times when, people couldn't enter certain places or buildings. I can remember myself as a young boy that we couldn't go into a picture theatre and sit in the back of the theatre, that we had to sit down the front. And I can remember that in shops being served, that if there were other people there when you came in, you'd have to wait for them to go and be served. But also you'd have to stand back and wait for people who came in after you until the store was empty, then you would be served.
My name's B.J. Cruz. I'm a descendant of Percy and Lucy Pepper. My father's Aussie Cruz. This here is the country of our people. My great grandparents was Percy and Lucy Pepper, and they grew up in the Deaboriginalisation assimilation period, which is why they weren't allowed to be buried here. And government developed the assimilation and de-Aboriginalisation program so that Aboriginal people would forget our culture, and we wouldn't fight for land rights because we wouldn't remember any of our special places and our sites. The government learnt this experience from the American Indian experience with the English in Canada, where they had a lot of whiskey drinking American Indians, and a lot of uprisings and a lot of factions and a lot of fighting over land. And so when they come to Australia, they knew they'd have the same problem here in Australia, so they developed a program of de-Aboriginalisation assimilation. And under the de-Aboriginalisation program, they had different missions. They had missions for tribal Aboriginal people and missions for half-caste Aboriginal people. And you weren't allowed to mix. And tribal people weren't allowed to speak any language to the young people. So they couldn't pass language down. They couldn't teach them no laws or no rules in traditional way. And so they rounded Aboriginal people up and took them from their traditional lands, and they put them on missions, and they looked after them with handouts and blanket issues and things like that. The Aboriginal people living in that lifestyle forgot a lot of their language, and a lot of language wasn't passed down. And I blame government for a lot of the problem within Aboriginal communities today, because they could have took a different approach. They didn't need to go down a process of de-Aboriginalisation, assimilation. They could have learnt from Aboriginal people. A lot of valuable knowledge has been lost over the years because of government policy. And if they'd have worked closer with Aboriginal people and negotiated, then things would have been different today. I don't know a lot about my great-grandparents, but all I know is that they lived at this place here and they weren't allowed to be buried here.
The early settlers, for their wisdom, were advised by anthropologists, and people had a strange idea that the white blood of European people was stronger than the black blood. But I think there was a lot more than that. I think during the era of the Darwin Theory, people thought that they'd found the missing link in the evolution of the human race, and they started in the very early settlement of Australia taking away bones and particularly skulls of Aboriginal people. And I can remember reading that's what Truganini feared most of all in her life. She was feared that they'd behead her and take a head away, and so that in that process of time, the Aboriginal people themselves were under a law that removed children that were half-caste, and they were removed en masse. It just wasn't my grandfather was taken, and they were taken away to train up to be good white people in this country. And when they were taken away to a government home, lots of times they ended up with missionaries and became like not only were the reserves like this place here at Lake Torres, but there were missions that became holding places for our children too. And they stayed there till about 11 or 12, and then they went on to a second grade place where they took them, where they started to enter them into, as they became teenagers, enter into apprenticeships. The girls went into domestic duties on farms and other places, and the men went into, or the young men went into apprenticeships in places where people would use their labour in their training. And so then our grandfather was caught up in that system. And
Percy Pepper of Cunningham appealed to John Murray, Chief Secretary of the Victorian Government, for help on the 22nd of September 1913. To the Chief Secretary, "Dear Sir, I'm a half-caste Aboriginal and I have a wife and 6 children to support. I find it very hard to make things meet as my wife is suffering from tubercle lungs and often has to lay up in bed for a week. I've been trying to build for the last 12 months and all I have is enough poles to make a 2-roomed place. I can't go any further than that. We've been living in a tent for 2 years and this is always bad. Cunningham agrees with the wife and we've tried other places but we've always been ordered back here on the account of her health. My oldest child is 10 years old and he's going to school 3 miles away in Cunningham. And when I'm away, the wife is in the tent with herself and the children. If the government could help me finish off building by letting me have the material, I'm willing to pay back in time payments, as I cannot go far away to work. The local police know of my hardship and the trouble I'm also having. I really do feel things hard and just trusting you will consider my case, as I'm really in need of help. I remain your humble servant, Percy Pepper of Cunningham."
He was a very humble man, and of course for him to actually have to even announce that he is a half-caste Aboriginal person, he wasn't allowed to even say, "I am an Aboriginal person. You know, I'm a Gunno person, I'm from Gippsland, this is my country, and yet I've got to get permission to do what I want." So it must have been really downgrading, I think, for him as well. As we were reading through these records, which are all in the archives of Victoria, it really brought our grandparents to life and gave them that sense of being, and we realised then exactly the footsteps that they'd taken to get to where they were and how important it was to survive, keep family together, and really to be resilient. They didn't really quite fit into the mainstream society or on the outskirts of they weren't black and they weren't white, so it was almost, where do we fit?
segregation was fairly widespread in Australia, and Beryl and I felt that a bit when we lived in Kempsey. When we were there for a short time, our children got sick and we took them to the hospital. And we thought we'd leave them there for a while because if we went there, we'd upset them and they'd want to come home with us. And after about 2 or 3 days, we went in to see them. And we were walking to the main part of the hospital and one of the persons there said, "No, they're not in there, they're over here." And so we started to walk in a different direction in the hospital. And we were walking down this long hallway and the kids saw us and they came running towards us with these long white gowns on, and we could see really, really clear the word ABO on the front of them, printed in red across the front of their little gowns. And we knew then that they were in the Abo part of the hospital. So we took our children with us and we took them home and we never took them back again.
My granddaughter, my daughter's daughter, she was going to school at Mount Evelyn, and it came up about Aboriginals, and I was telling, the teacher was talking about Aboriginality and Aboriginals, and they said there's not many around. And my granddaughter put her hand straight up. She said, I'm Aboriginal. She said, no, you're not. She said, I beg your pardon, I am Aboriginal. She said, you're not. She said, you've got blonde hair. She said, you can't be Aboriginal. She got up, cried, went outside. She said, when I get older, I'm coming back to have a go at you. But and she ran out the door crying, and she had to ring her mum up to come and pick her up. She was that upset, you know, saying she wasn't Aboriginal, and she said, I am. And even today, she's got two lovely little children, 2-year-old and 1-year-old, and even little Jack is only 2, and he can speak the language now. Glenys, my daughter, shows him the book, and he knows all the language and mum and all this sort of thing what we say. He says it too, and he understands, and he's real happy, and he loves looking at the old books.